Great, welcome and good afternoon. And I'm Blau. I'm the faculty director of the Data Center for Russian Immigration Studies. And we're very pleased, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this, our third session of this new year-long Data Center series, which is called Russia in Search of a New Paradigm, Conversations with Yevgenia Albats. In this series, which actually meets on Tuesdays, every other Tuesday from 5 to 7, usually in this room, although the next lecture will be, or next session will be in the room next door, then we'll be back here again. So in this series, veteran journalist and political scientist, Dr. Yevgenia Albats, talks with scholars, with military experts, with prominent journalists, and many others about the most pressing questions facing Russia and Russia watchers today. Among those questions are, why did Russia evolve into an aggressive militaristic power? Where has Putin found the resources to run the war despite massive economic sanctions imposed by the West? What did economists get wrong about Russia's economic capacities? Will the Russian Federation survive in its current form and size, or will it fall apart? And is there any chance for Russia to return to the road of democratic development? So today we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Dmitry Gorenburg and Mr. Aleksandr Golts. They will discuss Putin's military might, bluff, and reality with our series host and also with you, our audience. I invite you to participate actively in these discussions. They will be recorded and they will be posted on the Data Center's YouTube channel. But first I want to introduce our speakers, our participants. Yevgenia Albats is a Russian investigative journalist, a political scientist, an author, and a radio host. Since 2007, she's been the first political editor and then the editor-in-chief and CEO of The New Times, which is a Russian language independent political weekly, originally based in Moscow. In 2004, Albats started hosting Absolute Albats, a talk show on Echo of Moscow, the last remaining liberal radio station in Russia. Before that, she was an Alfred Friendly Press Fellow at the Chicago Tribune in 1990. She was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 1993. She's been a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists since its founding in 1996. Dr. Albats has also spent quite a bit of time in academia. She was a full-time professor at Moscow's Higher School of Economics, where she taught the institutional theory of the state and bureaucracy until 2011, when her courses were canceled at the request of Kremlin officials. Since 2017, she's been a fellow and visiting professor at a number of universities, American universities, including the University of Pennsylvania, University of Michigan, at Ann Arbor, and at Yale. She has also spent a considerable amount of time here at Harvard. After graduating from Moscow State University, she received her PhD in political science from Harvard in 2004. She was a senior scholar at the Data Center from 2019 to 2021, and she has returned this academic year as a visiting scholar to host this new speaker series on Russia's impact on international security and stability. Between these two stints at the Data Center, she was a Shorenstein Fellow at Harvard in 2023-24. In addition to journalism, Dr. Albats is the author of 4 books, including one on the history of the Russian political police, the KGB. Dmitry Gorenburg is a senior research scientist at the Strategy, Policy, Plans, and Programs Division of the Center for Naval Analyses. Dr. Gorenburg is a Data Center associate And previously, he served as executive director of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, which is now the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, or ACES. His research interests include security issues in the former Soviet Union, Russian military reform, Russian foreign policy, and ethnic politics and identity. Dr. Gorenburg is the author of Nationalism for the Masses, Minority Ethnic Mobilization in the Russian Federation, published by Cambridge University Press, 2003, and he has published extensively in journals such as World Politics and Post-Soviet Affairs. He currently serves as the editor of Problems of Post-Communism and was editor of Russian Politics and Law from 2009 to 2016. Dr. Gorenburg, received his BA in International Relations from Princeton University and his PhD in Political Science from Harvard. Aleksandr Golts is a Russian journalist. He has served on the editorial board of Krasnaya Zvezda. Get my mouth right. Editor, yes, and a Soviet, then Russian, military daily. He also served as military editor for Itogi, a premier Russian news magazine, and he was also a military advocate for the New Times and the Moscow Times. Mr. Golts has been a visiting fellow at Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation, the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies of Uppsala University in Sweden. He's the author of several books, including Military Reform and Militarism in Russia and Surviving the Cold War Experience of Diplomacy. Since 2022, he's been an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Before turning things over to Dr. Albats, I want to just make a quick plug for the next two events in the series. On Tuesday, October 22nd, 2 weeks from today, Dr. Albats will be in conversation with David Hoffman, who is contributing editor at the Washington Post. The title of that session is The Coming Arms Race, Russia, China, America, and Nuclear Weapons. On Tuesday, November 12th, Dr. Albats will talk with Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, and Susan Glasser, staff writer of the New Yorker, about the US administration and Russia, whatever that administration will be. Without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Albats and Dr. Gorenburg and Mr. Golts with our time.
Thank you very much for this, lovely presentation. Thank you very much. And so thank you very much for coming. Today we have a critical seminar conversation, slash interview on Putin's military might. What is real and what is a bluff? There is much confusion in the media, and of course, in the American media as well, regarding the state of the war in Ukraine. Some say that Ukraine is losing the war, and thus it should negotiate a peace deal with Putin, land occupied by the Russian army in exchange for a frozen conflict. Others suggest that, on the contrary, Russia's success on the battlefield is marginal. As a gift for yesterday's dictator's birthday, Russian generals promised to kick out Ukrainian troops from Russian soil in the Kursk region, but they failed. Anne Applebaum of The Atlantic, in her recent report from Ukraine, argues that the assumption that Ukraine is losing the war is wrong, and as an example suggests that Ukraine, a country without much of a navy, defeated Russian Black Sea Fleet, thanks to Ukrainian sea drones. So today, Dr. Dmitry Gorenburg of the CNA and Aleksandr Golts, currently with the Swedish Center for East European Studies, He left Russia, as I did, after in 2022. Are going to give their analysis of the Putin's military might. Dmitry Gorenburg, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. So, I think we'll start talk a little bit about. I think there are some misconceptions about why the Russian invasion went as poorly as it did at the beginning, because a lot of times, a lot of the conversation has to do with, well, maybe the Russian military isn't so strong, and so it's, paper tiger and all this, and I don't think that that's actually accurate. So I wanted to just start by walking you through a little bit about what really went wrong, and I would argue that the problems were caused primarily by bad strategy rather than a lack of capabilities per se. So, and there were also, combined with a number of intangible factors like command and control, organization that wasn't quite as good as people thought it was, certainly morale issues. So that's kind of at the highest level, I think, where we're at. So some specifics. One area where they started off on the wrong foot at the beginning is that rather than carrying out an act a straightforward military operation according to the doctrine that the Russian military kind of practices and follows, this operation was really planned out by the FSB, not by the military. And so it was kind of this decapitation operation that didn't really take into account some of the limitations of any military, not including the Russian military, and also some of the capabilities of the Ukrainians. So for one thing they did is that I think is the fault of the FSB, is that they misjudged the Ukrainians. They expected a lot less resistance, so then they could, if you expect, there's a little bit of parallels to some people in, when thinking about the Iraq War in 2003, and there was sort of this idea that people will greet them as liberators in eastern and southern Ukraine, and that obviously didn't happen. So they kind of believed a little bit of their own propaganda on that score, right? So that was one. And second problem is that they didn't prepare their troops properly. A lot of troops had not been told that they would be invading Ukraine. Some were told that they were participating in a military exercise, others that they were just being sent to the eastern Donbass region where there was already fighting. So that meant they weren't psychologically prepared to take, real casualties, right? If you think you're going to an exercise and suddenly you're invading another country, that could cause some problems. So that could take an immediate toll on troops' morale. And when you combine that with some of the organizational issues that I'll touch on in a second, the morale can really suffer. So another problem, and that's tied to the strategy, is insufficient logistics. So if you expect that you can take out the capital, change the regime, take over much of the territory in a few weeks, and captured war plans make it clear that they thought this will last about 3 weeks, then you don't stock enough supplies for the longer fight. And you don't make enough plans for resupply. And that causes problems when the war drags on initially, right, in the first few months. So, and there were other problems that, the resupply, when they did the resupply that there was there, some of the convoys or trains would get attacked and destroyed, and that disrupted the operation as well. They also failed to permanently take out Ukraine's air defenses. They took out, they were able to destroy the stationary ones, but Ukrainians fortunately, were able to disperse their mobile units right at the last minute, really in the last day or two before the invasion. So that allowed them to resume action and prevented the Russian Air Force from carrying out a bombing campaign that really could have seriously deteriorated Ukrainian capabilities. Right? So that meant, and that meant that Russian ground operations were taking place without sufficient air support because the aircraft weren't really able to operate as much as they expected. And then, again, because they were expecting not to encounter as much resistance, they attacked on too many fronts at once. They kind of dispersed their capabilities, and they didn't have a unified command and control because they weren't thinking of this as a regular military operation. And one might say this: they neglected to really consider the size of Ukraine. But I mean, they know how big Ukraine is. I think
you're talking about February and March, 2022.
Yeah, why they failed.
But wait a second, if we fast forward and we get into the autumn of 2022, Russians had to have, I'm sorry, in 22, Russians had problems. Ukrainians managed to deoccupy.
I'll get to that. One second.
Okay.
So, okay, and this is the last one, and then I'll get to that, promise. They failed to have a plan B. That's the last one. They had no backup plan for what to do when their initial plan didn't go right. Yep. So the troops kind of kept going in the, as they were originally ordered. So you'd have armored convoys being dispatched without infantry support. That made them easy targets, etc. I won't. Oh, go on. But then they made adjustments, and we actually saw. We have to remember that in between the problems they had in the fall of 22 and the problems they had at the beginning, there was a period when they were gaining territory in May, June, July, right? So they made adjustments, and they did what their doctrine. They said, okay, it's a military operation. They were doing actually things very similarly to what they're doing now. But but they weren't yet fully mobilized for war. Yeah. So what's the standard doctrine? Artillery for Russian military, artillery-based attacks with mostly with small units rather than this kind of American-style maneuver warfare with large combined arms, right? So. And if you're attacking and you have a situation where your side has an advantage in artillery and fires and manpower, then that can lead to slow and steady gains. And that's what we saw that spring. But then Russia began to run out of soldiers. And that was the problem in the fall of 2022, right? And that allowed to Ukraine to make its most significant gains of the whole subsequent war. And Russia's response was partial mobilization, as everyone probably all remembers, right? Which fixed the problem, at least in the short term, of shortages of manpower. Not 100%, but enough. So they could maintain their lines. They could build some reserve units for a later offensive that didn't go super well, but nonetheless, they were doing that. So maybe it might be good to show you some maps. I'll share that. And let's see. Current slide. Okay, so here we have they built the other thing they did that is also very much according to Russian doctrine is they built defensive lines, and that was sufficient to stop the big counteroffensive. So now we're in spring 2023, right?
Okay.
And you can see on this map that Ukrainian gains at that point were fairly small. Why? Because there was a combination of Russian defenses being, many layers of mines and so forth, and and Ukraine kind of telegraphing exactly where they were going to attack.
Wait a second. You're talking about the spring of 2023?
Spring of
It
2023.
was pretty calm. I was there. There were no big fighting. There were just,
sorry.
They were using Calibs.
So this is the big counter, maybe it was June.
missiles.
Let's say June.
Yeah,
Okay,
uh-huh.
June, fine. But the big Ukrainian counteroffensive that started in June and was supposed to, there was some possibility that the goal was to cut off the land bridge, the land bridge, go to the Azov Sea, right? And that didn't happen, obviously.
Right.
But that's because why am I telling you all this? Because the Russian military had the capabilities to do this, to stop. Once they stopped doing crazy things that were ordered by the FSB and started fighting the way they were trained to fight, they were equal, more or less, to the Ukrainian.
But they also built, the Surovikin's line.
That's what I'm saying. Defensive lines. Defensive lines.
Mm-hmm.
That's the doctrine. That's how you put in mines, put in fortifications. Now it's very hard to advance for the opponent.
Right.
Okay? So that's that's what they've been doing since then. There have been some adjustments, some mostly tactical, so they use drones more. Both sides use drones more, but Russians use drones a lot more than at the beginning.
Because they managed to get it from Iran. Shahed.
Yes,
Yeah.
but they also improved their own production. And there's one of my colleagues is working a lot on this kind of there's a Russian word for it that I'm forgetting, but basically homemade like volunteer efforts to build small drones for the Russian military. And it's yeah, so there's a huge effort, and that has changed reconnaissance and has changed certain targeting and things like that, and it's much harder to move units without being spotted now than in previous wars. But it's still largely the same Russians fighting the way they're trained to fight. Yeah, some other innovations. They use glide bombs now from aircraft, right? That's new because the aircraft themselves can't penetrate too far into Ukrainian airspace because they might get shot down. So now you can launch bombs from Russian territory that the bombs move rather than the plane. And so then you can attack the front lines, and that's been quite damaging. And then you have an environment where now suddenly Ukraine, and we don't want to talk too much about it, but there was a period of time when Ukraine was facing a shortage of both shells because delays in assistance from the US, and manpower because they didn't get their mobilization organized properly.
They have the same shortage now?
It's better now, but yes. They got some things organized, but yes. So, and that's where Russia starts advancing again, right? So now we're in a situation where if you follow the headlines in the media, you think that Ukraine is losing lots of territory, right? Like every week there's a report, this village fell, this city fell, right? And if you look at, and so here's a map that this isn't exactly, this is some weeks old now, but if you look at like the red territories where it was already controlled, and then the various other colors are some, other than the purple, are the Russian advances, and they've advanced a little bit more. The news today was Russian troops have entered Toretsk, and they're closer to Pokrovsk. That's been the main effort. So than this map. So it looks, okay, significant, right? But if you look at it in a bigger picture, you can see that this is very small compared to even the territory of the Donbass, much less. So incremental gains is where Russia is, and so that's where we are now. So continued incremental slow progress, right? And that's where the forces are. And we can talk later about, the defense industrial side of how this continues. But that's basically the adjustment. So the takeaway is that Russian forces are, they're not at the level that maybe people thought they were. They are not, but they're not competing with the US military. They're competing with the Ukrainian military, which is good, but it's not, it's a lower level than, and the Ukrainian military has advanced a lot over the 10 years now that they've been fighting, but it's still it has the same doctrine originally, right, as this kind of artillery first, and so that creates a situation where a country with somewhat more resources, both in terms of population, in terms of industry, in terms of revenues from oil sales and so forth, you probably heard about that 2 weeks ago, can have a small but steady advantage. And that's where we are. And that's where we were likely to continue to be for at least the next year or 2 years.
Okay.
Eva, what's the blue on this map?
Oh, yeah. So the blue is the territory that Ukraine has regained since February 22nd, right? And red is the territory that Russia controls. And also, I guess I don't have a pointer here, but you can see the little blue segment of Kursk that is inside Russian territory, right? That you can see kind of on the top there, like a slightly lighter blue. That's the Kursk offensive.
Okay. So, if I ask you directly, do you agree with those who say that Ukraine is losing the war and it's time for Zelensky to agree for whatever demands Putin has for him?
No, Ukraine is not losing the war, and the situation is close. It's not a stalemate, but it's closer to a stalemate than to one side winning or losing. Right? As long as Ukraine can continue to get support from the West, because it does depend on weapon supplies, right? It can continue to fight this war for years, but so can Russia, right? So the war will be won or lost politically, not like it's about will to fight.
Can you elaborate?
Right? Yeah. The question is resolve, like will to fight, right? So when we talk about how can, what is Putin expecting? He's expecting that the West will decide we've had enough, we're going to stop supporting Ukraine. And then Ukraine can't stand on its own, right? So that's creating a narrative that Ukraine is losing is much more important than actually taking, Toretsk or Vuhledar or whatever city, right? Similarly, on the other side, Russia's never going to lose enough territory to stop fighting. I just don't see that that's the way to win this war. The Ukraine launching some counteroffensive that takes, yes, they can take some more, if the right conditions, they could retake some territory. But it's really the economic strength of Russia, right? If Russia can continue to support the war politically and economically, then it can continue to fight. And the way that can be broken is not by some Ukrainian, ground troops advancing somewhere, but on a larger scale where, is a oil revenue, mentioned oil revenues dry up, or there's such high inflation that there's protests, or something like those, some financial crisis, or some political crisis, right? But that's where I think the tension point is.
Okay, Alexander. Let me switch to Alexander. Alexander, I remember, when I was still in Moscow, in July of 2022, I spoke to one of your colleagues, he's still in Moscow, I'm not going to name him, but, one of those who considered to be a very good military analyst. And, there were a whole bunch of us, it was, of course, some sort of, the Soviet-style clandestine meeting, so to avoid, airdropping from the side of the FSB, my lovely Chekists. And he said, and I was asking him, what's going to happen? How long Putin will manage to run this war? And, already, hundreds of thousands Russians and Ukrainians killed, already Bucha happened, all these atrocities happened in Bucha, Borodyanka, in Irpin, and also in the Kharkiv region, etc. And he said, Zhenya, don't worry, Russians are going to run out of ammunition by the end of October 2022. And, if you, like me, are seeking good news, because I didn't want to leave and I was trying to figure out how long should I go into hiding inside Russia, what to do, and etc. Anyway, to cut the long story short, of course, we know that yes, I remember, even, Ukrainians were telling me, Russians are running out of missiles, they're no longer caliber, they used to bomb Kyiv on regular basis, and then they started to do it, every other week. Anyway, so tell me, how did Putin manage to get his ammunition? And listen, we heard from Zelensky, when he was here in the United States, that for every one shell that Ukrainian army has, Russians have 10. So I also want to say that, I remember your article that you published in the New Times back in 2014, and there was this, these conversations where Russians were going to continue trying to occupy from Donbass then take over Mariupol and go all the way to Crimea, because Crimea was in bad need of supply, and there was a problem with water, and etc. And you wrote an article, you said, no, Russians don't have the capabilities. They have 165,000 troops capable to control the territory. That's it. Now Russians control Mariupol region, half of Kherson region, half of Kharkiv region, half of Zaporozhye. So, and of course, Donbass, and, that's what Putin is trying to do. He's trying to totally occupy Donbass, which is, by the way, he put, as a territory in the Russian constitution. So tell me, how did he do this?
Okay, Zhenya. Russian war against Ukraine was a catastrophe in many, many dimensions. In my...
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry? Is it okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Again, Russian war was a catastrophe in many dimensions. And one of these dimensions is a total catastrophe for military analysts, because none of their prognosis... Can I speak?
Yes, go ahead.
None of their prognosis was fulfilled. I can remind you, for example, all these libraries of books about future warfare. Now we can see absolutely another war on the battlefield in Ukraine. I can remind you the reaction of experts to American leaks 2 weeks before the invasion. None of us really believed in these leaks. Then experts started to say, okay, Russia will smash Ukrainians in 1 week. Then turning 180 degrees, said, okay, Russians are so weak, Ukrainians will kick them out. I can continue this list. In my mind, we should not understand Russian opportunities, Russian military capabilities, if not turn to Soviet past. I think that Soviet past is very important heritage Putin is using now. Let's look at Soviet army. It was ideal and classical mass mobilization armed forces. The idea was to defend the country, calling under colors millions of reservists. According to the last Soviet General Staff plans, in case of emergency, they had planned to call something like 8 million people in a month. For this reason, to be able to do so, Soviet armed forces were a huge training center. The number of armed forces in peacetime was 5+ million people. And the basic idea of the army was to push through the armed forces to train as much future reservists as possible. Another problem was to arm all these reservists in case of emergency. And Soviet Union had ideal system of arms building. Look, it had nothing to do with real economy, but I stress, each Soviet enterprise, nevertheless, did it produce pasta, toys, or anything, had so-called mobilization task. And it should produce something for military in case of emergency. It did not permit Russian normal goods to be more or less sufficient, because managers has to pay money for having these long lines of military production, doing nothing and bringing new profits at all. You need Gosplan to balance prices artificially. But at the end of the day, we had very sufficient military industry. But these people in Politburo, they were, honestly speaking, they were very skeptical about ability of Soviet industry. They knew for sure that Western industry is much more efficient, but they planned conventional warfare for months or something else before nuclear engagement will start. So they had an idea, okay, their industry is much better than ours. Let's build as many military equipment, as many tanks, armed vehicles, warships, fighter jets, everything as we can, and store it in order to use during global warfare. For these particular reasons, we had these more than 60,000 tanks. Everybody in the West was sure that Soviet Union was ready to break through La Manche or something like the English Channel or something like that. No, they want these 60,000 tanks, which is 3 times more than Americans had, and 2 times more than all other countries in the world, only just to prepare to this global war. For obvious reason, this system collapsed after collapse of Soviet Union. And this mobilization armed forces showed itself totally inefficient during Chechen wars and war against Georgia. Military reform, in fact, it was rejection from Serdyukov reforms. It was total rejection from mass mobilization concept. Serdyukov closed not.
Excuse me. Serdyukov was the Minister of Defense.
Defense in 2008, 2012. Yeah.
Yes, 2008, 2012. Okay.
Yes, and as the result, there were. He closed. Just think. He closed. He cut the number of units within ground forces in 11 times. As the result, Putin received fully staffed 20 plus armed brigades, and they showed themselves very effectively during 2014 invasion in Crimea. In my mind, the best result reached by Russian army was happened in February 26th of 2014, when, according Putin order, something like 50,000 troops deployed along Russian-Ukrainian border. It's a modest result, again, if we compare with Americans' deployment. But keep in mind that in 1999, it took 3 full weeks before first battalion of paratroopers began to deploy in Dagestan after Chechen incursion. And unfortunately, Putin read absolutely wrongly these good results of 2014 invasion. He thought he can invade European countries. In my mind, all these false FSB reports and all failure of Russian army came because people received orders they could not fulfill. Just if you have 200,000 troops, you cannot invade big European countries. It's totally impossible.
I would say good, sir. But I would ask you. We don't have that much time.
Okay, I'll be. Jenny, don't worry.
No, listen to me. Answer my question. I want to know, how did he manage to rebuild Russian army after that, he was lacking ammunition in the autumn of 2022? And what is he left with now? What are his might now? Please, no longer,
Okay. After failures of the autumn 2022, we can suppose that he asked his generals what to do. And the answer was very clear. We should return to this mobilization model. What does it mean? It meant that we should return to mobilization system, and they revived this mobilization system in 2023, when first they, after this not very successful partial mobilization, they start volunteer mobilization, paying a lot of money to people who signed the contract. And point number 2, they began to use these huge Soviet deports of military equipment. Nobody knew what to do with this equipment for 30 years. But now they are ready to, when we have information when they say proudly that Russian plants, military plants work 7 days, 24 hours, it's true, but what they are not producing new equipment. What they are doing officially it's named modernization, but they make very old tanks, armed vehicles, artillery, more or less walkable. Look, now they use T-55, which means that the production started 70 years ago and was ended in the middle of 60s. When I read in Red Star, my beloved Red Star, that A-10 howitzer is a good cannon, I did not believe my eyes, because this A-10 howitzer was produced in 40s. Nevertheless, we have the type of war in Ukraine permit them to use this very antique military equipment. Even more, in this type of war, these three very old T-55 tanks is better than one Leopard, because one of them can make a shoot and destroy this Leopard. How long can it last? The biggest question. Look at these figures taken from military balance. At the beginning of 2023, Russia had something like 5,000 tanks in its depots. Now, to the beginning of 2024, they have 4,000. So it means that they lost 1,000 tanks in battles during the year. And please keep in mind that during 2003, they conducted mostly defensive operation. Now they are conducting offensive operation, and it takes, they lose much more military equipment. More or less the same with all other figures. And it moves us to understanding that,
what is it, this IFV?
Infantry fighting vehicle.
Infantry
fighting vehicle.
And what is it, APC?
Artillery. It's artillery pieces.
Armored personnel carriers.
Armored personnel carriers. Okay. Okay.
Okay, so you can see that these figures are diminishing, and if these figures are true, we can conclude that maybe in year 2026, this resource will be exhausted. You to understand, as we can see, Russia badly needs at least 1,000 tanks a year. Uralmashzavod is producing only 300 new tanks a year. So the same can be said about human resources. It's more or less clear that this innovative system of volunteer mobilization, again, it doesn't work. For this reason, regions are rising price for signing the contract. Now we have unbelievable money, 3 million in Belgorodsk and Khanty-Mansiyski okrug. So it means more or less that resources can be exhausted. The single way out, in my mind, will be total mobilization, or at least the use of conscripts. It's quite possible, I think. But what about military equipment? And here, I think the single chance to support new mass mobilization will be turned to Soviet practice. They badly need to restore Soviet economy 2.0, to renationalize all these enterprises. By the way, this process started in year 2023. They took, at least according to my estimation, something like 125 private enterprises. And it was very interesting. Chemizov, who is chief of Rostech, the main military industrial company in the country, who said, okay, we are looking, if we need something, we can take it. So if we should watch very attentively, if they turn to total industrial nationalization, it will be path to mass mobilization. It will permit Putin and his subordinates to conduct the war next few years. If not, they should finish the war in, let's say, 3 next years.
Alexander, in the latest analytical piece published on the website of the Swedish Institute for East European Studies, you pose a question. Is Russia losing a war of attrition? Do you really believe that Russia is losing this war of attrition? And if so,
Zhenya, I just put a question. What happened after Kursk incursion? It became absolutely and totally clear that Russia has no strategic reserves.
In terms of manpower or ammunition?
Sorry?
In terms of manpower or ammunition?
In terms of formed units, which they can deploy. And the biggest question appears, and it was a reason for my article, where are all these people? Russia is recruiting, according to reports, Russia is recruiting 1,000 men a day. Where are all these people? So it can mean only that Russia lost something like 500,000 men in hostilities. But
You mean dead and injured?
Yes, yes.
But that's the number of the British intelligence. American War Institute provides something like 350,000.
Okay, it's not a question of thousand. Again, fact is a fact. They have no strategic reserves. And if we speak about Ukraine, the question, again, it's interesting. Kursk showed that Ukrainians are able to mobilize people and to use them properly in specific directions. For me, it's a question I cannot answer. Ukraine is not my field of analysis, but there are very controversial reports about Ukrainian mobilization. Mike Kaufman, for example, wrote that Ukrainians managed to rise number of volunteers and mobilized in 2 times after these May decrees. We don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much. Alexander, I will have more questions, but now, I will switch to Dmitry Gorenburg. Dmitry, you published just, recently, you published a CNN report, you co-authored this report, and you argue and you write about structural problems of the Russian defense industry, its technological backwardness, corruption, lack of workforce, and etc. Are those variables significant for the war of attrition? Some argue that the kind of war that we see in Ukraine, it's the World War I. It's not even the World War II, it's the World War I type of a war. So,
Yeah, maybe I want to add one thing first.
Okay.
Because I think you had the question before about what happened after the fall of, they had this shell shortage, right?
Right.
North Korea happened, right? One of the factors that shifted, in the fall of 22, Ukraine had a massive advantage in terms of firepower.
Okay.
And that's why they were gaining territory, yeah? But then two things happened, not at the same time, but over a period of a year. One, Russia made a deal with North Korea to get a large supply of shells that they used to, they filled their manpower gaps by this partial mobilization, and they filled the shell gaps from North Korea.
Okay.
At the same, maybe even a little earlier, they ramped up their own production, right? They have, Vagon Zavod can only produce 300 tanks, that's true. But they have increased, and they haven't really increased, they haven't increased too much, but they have increased the amount of shells they can produce, and also the amount of missiles they can produce, yeah? And I don't have numbers with me, but there's data available, and you can see that.
According to the former Prime Minister Kasyanov, Russians produce 4.6 million shells a year, as opposed to that, United States of America plus European Union can produce something 1.3 million shells or 1.5 million shells. So Russians produce 3 times that you guys are capable to produce.
Well, and that's why we saw the United States during, to supply the counteroffensive in 2023. They were bought shells one time, right, from stores. They got shells from South Korea. They got shells from Israel. U.S. shells, but they were stored in Israel.
Okay.
This was before October 7th. So
okay.
They got, there were all these, but you're absolutely right. The production wasn't increased the same way that Russia did, which is why now we're in a position where Russia has an advantage in ammunition. They have, the manpower. I agree with Sasha. So this is just a graphic from this report that we just did, which is actually mostly focused on how Russian defense industry is coping with sanctions. But where Russia is getting, and this is already the problem with getting these kinds of things cleared for public releases, they're never completely up to date. So you can now make Iran and missiles green also. Yeah, there's now evidence that Iran is supplying some missiles as well. But Russia is dependent to, not completely, but to some extent, on the top 3 countries, UAE not so much, but a few things, but the top to keep its war machine going. North Korea and Iran for actual weapons, and China not for weapons, but for components, for their own, for Russia making their own, what?
Despite of the secondary sanctions imposed by the United States.
Yeah. I mean, it makes it harder, and there are limits, but so that's direct. There's also another component, which is parallel, something that's called, whoops, I don't know why it's advancing itself, parallel imports, right? And this is where, what parallel import means is components that are coming from Western countries, or Asian countries that are part of the coalition, and getting to Russia through these other sort of third parties. And so this is kind of the kinds of things and the kinds of countries right here. But here, I think this is a great chart that Kiev School of Economics did, where this is material that's coming to specifically for the production of weapons, right, in Russia. And you can see that the country of producers, that's kind of who designed the weapons, right? What country owns the intellectual property, runs the factory and so forth. And you can see that about half, almost as much as China, is coalition. That coalition is United States, EU, Japan, so on. But then as you move along, so country of origin, so now a lot of the manufacturing is actually taking place in China. And then it's being imported to Russia through China also, but also Hong Kong, and then a bunch of those other countries that we just listed. And then eventually it ends up in Russia. So these are paths through which the Russian war machine is being supplied. And so that's battlefield goods, and then you see very much the same thing for critical components. Even more, the components are really coming, they're designed in the West by and large, 94%, but then they're manufactured in a lot of different places, including in the West. But then they get imported through these kind of back channels, and then eventually they end up in, again, Hong Kong or Turkey or China, and then eventually they end up in Russia. So that's a big part of how the Russian military is able to keep functioning. And so advanced machine tools are critical for making weapons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that initially, after sanctions were implemented, there was a big drop. But then these parallel channels were developed and improved, and then you get to a point where you're almost at the same level, or in some cases higher than the level of what they had in January of 2022. So and again, there's lots of information available on which countries this is coming through, and so it's just a little bit more of a breakdown. This is all these Kiev School of Economics people are doing great work on this. So that's and this is machine tools here, but that's how the Russian military machine is able to keep functioning. Is they need these components from the West.
When you're talking about components, what exactly do you mean?
Chips, microchips.
That's chips, first of all.
Microchips and machine tools are the most important ones.
Mm-hmm.
Other things too, but those are the critical ones. So microchips we all understand. Machine tools is like how if you're going to make parts for weapons, you need precision machine tools, right? Lathes and all these things. I'm not an engineer. I don't know exactly what, but that's and the best ones are made in Germany is the best, right? South Korea maybe, and China's are not as good. So they're fine for a lot of, like, if you need to modernize your T-54 tank or even T-72 tank, it's fine. But if you need to make a new Iskander missile or something, then maybe not so fine. So you need these Western machine tools. So the more that is, and since we wrote this, especially since this past summer, the West has been doing more and more to try to cut off the supply, and it's hard because you sanction one shell company, they create a new shell company the next day, right? And so but that's the process, and there are ways to do this. More on the internal policing on the producer side, rather than trying to get the people who are trying to sell the stuff when it's already in Hong Kong.
The Russian media in exile, The Insider, reported that in some ammunition discovered, by Ukrainians on the battlefield, there were parts from the and components from the United States.
Yes.
How not it's possible?
Well,
With one hand, you support Ukraine, with another, you supply.
Well, that's what I was just describing. That's what I was just describing. They're not reporting. Nobody's importing these. No company in the United States is saying, "Oh, we're going to sell some chips to Russia." No, they sell the chips to Turkey or to some, United Arab Emirates or someplace like that. Then it gets.
And they don't know that it will get to Russians, no?
Maybe they do. Then we don't know. We don't.
We're talking about money. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, but that's the process.
Capitalism. Yeah, I understand. Okay.
Sorry. I just put up here. We do have some. I mean, the report I was just referring to is the green one there, but we've got some other ones that have just come out in the last few days. So also one on mobilization. So that's on the website there. But you had a different question before that I probably didn't, or maybe you didn't. Maybe I did answer your question. Did I answer your question? Good.
Yes, thank you. But I have another one.
Okay.
And both to you and, I have plenty of questions, but of course, then I will give, floor to questions from the audience. But, first tell me, and Sasha, that's also a question to you. So Putin ordered an increase in the Russian army by some 182,000 troops. That's 3 armies, right? What does that tell you about his intentions? First of all, how long will it take to train these people? Does he have enough officers to, to command? And most importantly, what does it tell you about his intentions? What is he trying to do?
Well, there's 2 things here. One is the immediate, which is the short term, right? Which is the war against Ukraine. And what it tells me is that he expects it to continue for the foreseeable future. But there's also a second part, and that's kind of obvious, right? The second part is that he's also thinking ahead about
the war in Europe.
Well,
expanding the war of,
well, I don't know if I wouldn't go that far, but reconstituting the military to be prepared, right? It's like the Soviet military. It doesn't mean that we're going to tomorrow invade Germany, but it does mean that we should be ready in case there's a war, right? So the Russian ground forces have suffered a lot of damage. Units have been destroyed, reconstituted, and destroyed again, in some cases. And also, they want to, the war was started officially, or in part, because of the threat of NATO and expansion, to Ukraine. At least that's one of the things they've said.
I totally disagree with that.
No. That's what I'm saying. That's
what prevented him to do it earlier.
No, that's the Russian.
And not to occupy Baltics.
Jane, that's the Russian propaganda.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. That's the
But
Russian.
please, say it's not.
That's why I said
Okay.
ostensibly. That's
okay.
the Russian message. That's the Russian message.
Okay.
But what did they get? The expansion of NATO. Instead of supposed never actually going to happen, expansion to Ukraine if there had not been a war, actual expansion to Finland and Sweden, and the Russian reaction is we need more forces in northwest Russia to defend against the coming Finnish invasion. So they need more troops for defending, or it can be defending also, but they need more. So that's my takeaway. First and foremost is that when Putin talks about that we are really at war with the West, and war doesn't mean we're shooting; it means like Cold War was war, right? We should believe him.
Okay, Aleksandr, do you have to add anything, with respect to this 182?
Okay, look, in my mind, it's more bureaucratic movement than something else. As we remember, Shoigu's report in 2022, at the end of 2022,
Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation.
Yes.
Okay.
He directly asked for 1.5 million people. It's not real people. We should keep in mind, it's not real people. It's just staff positions, which usually in Russian armed forces are not filled. Again, it's not a story about they want to enlarge armed forces as far as they can, but there are obvious limits for this.
Okay, tell me, 182,000 troops, how long will it take to train them?
Okay, according mobilization norms, it's something like a month, no more, and then sent to the battle.
Do they have
according Soviet manuals, if you like.
But of course, they don't have those people.
Right. Okay.
If they had them, they could train them quickly and some.
When we spoke with you, Alexander, prior to this event, you told me that most likely Putin is going to increase the draft. That all
Yes.
these young people. So tell me, quickly about that. What's going to happen with the conscripts?
Okay, again, he has two resources for mobilization. First is general mobilization reserve, something like 25 million people between age of 18 to 51, according Russian laws. But as we could see, the total mobilization is not to effect. My feeling is that he can use, and he is moving now with his generals to idea to use conscripts. It's more rational from cynical and military point of view. You just can keep these conscripts in units there prepared and use them partly, send them to the battlefield. And now it's very interesting that deputy chief of main mobilization department of MOD, during his briefing, he said, for sure we will not use conscripts in new Russian territory, which means, for me at least, that they can use conscripts in Kursk, for example, where we have heavy hostilities.
Thank you. Dmitry, so next year, the Russian military budget is expected to be 33% of the federal budget, or 6.5% of the nation's GDP. It's more than in 2024. How would you explain that? Why does Putin need more money?
Well, so the combination of things. One, the payments, as Sasha pointed out, the payments for recruiting are increasing. So you need more money to pay people, right? Because the patriots have all enlisted, and now there aren't so many patriots left who are, so you need to pay money to get the manpower you need. Because Sasha's absolutely right. You can get more conscripts, but unless you change the rule and send the conscripts to actual Ukrainian territory to fight, they're not going to help you in Zaporizhia or
I love
Donbass.
that you guys still believe that Putin obeys by some rules. He can do whatever he wants.
Of course he can, but he hasn't so far. You're right. He could change the rule. He could absolutely, but so far he hasn't. So for now, assuming that he doesn't think actually on January 1, 2025, I'm changing this rule, he needs to budget to pay those people to go fight.
Okay.
right? So that's one. Two, they still need to make more weapons. They need to pay Iran or North Korea or whoever it is for whatever they're not sending them for free, right? The parallel imports that I was talking about, they can get the stuff, but it's more expensive than the old ways. So all of these things cost money. Before, the budget was set up with this assumption that the war will end. We will win, and it's fine, and then we can reduce expenditure. Now, the war is not ending, so they have to revise. And then the expenses are going up, and also there's inflation. So things are more expensive, just in ruble terms, right?
Right.
So all of this means you need more money.
Thank you. I have more questions, and I will follow up with these questions later on. But now I would like to give the floor to the audience. Yes, we have. Yeah, Nina, thank you so much.
And if you could please just introduce yourself, just so.
Yes.
Hi, thanks for the commentary.
Not sure.
In a war of attrition, God is on the side of bigger battalions. It's a 4-to-1 ratio in population, let's say, between Russia and Ukraine. What is the kill ratio, or casualty ratio in the current war right now? Because that's ultimately, in a war of attrition, probably the most important number. Putting material aside and morale aside, what do the numbers look like? And a related question is, what is the political implications of a full-blown mobilization on the Russian side? Can Putin pull it off?
Yes, please introduce yourself.
Mark Schneider.
Sasha, do you know about I don't know the numbers on the kill ratios. I don't know if you do.
Sorry, I don't understand. Sorry.
Casualty rates. Comparing casualty rates of Russian and Ukrainian. What do they
Okay. Look, it's one of the biggest problems here. Speaking about Russian casualty rates, we know for sure that figures produced by British Defense Ministry. I mentioned there's something like 500,000 people, and we know nothing, and we should assume that Ukrainians' figures are more or less the same. And look, if we speak in terms of war on attrition, we have a classical war, attrition warfare, in First World War. And you should keep in mind that victory and failure in this war was not the result of hostilities. It was not the result of situation on the battlefield. First revolution is in Russia, which took from the scene one of the main players, and then revolution in Germany. Germans were more or less successful on the battlefield at that time. And it's a tricks of war on attrition. So it's a big question. It's not ours, in my mind, Dmitry. It's not a question to us. It's a question to sociologists who knows public support or public rejection to support its government in Russia and in Ukraine. That is the main reason in which we should speak about war and attrition. Just one more thing. Ukraine can have advantage on the battlefield in this war on attrition, but the basic question is the support to Ukraine from Western countries. In my humble opinion, look, everybody in the West is speaking now how to keep existing support to Ukraine on the same level. To win, Ukraine's, in my estimation, needs at least 2 to 3 times more. And people, public in the West should understand at the end of the day that it is a situation of new Cold War.
Yeah, I'll just I'll address the mobilization question and also add that, and this is exactly what I was talking about when I was talking about the political will being more important than you know the exact numbers. The question about mobilization, and I think that
In Russia.
in Russia, that the reason, you know, Putin has done everything he can to avoid another mobilization. Why? We don't know exactly, but we suspect that he thinks it would be politically dangerous. With perhaps a second component, which is that the people that, I mean, we have to remember that the unemployment rate is officially like something like 2.4%, I think, in
Yeah,
Russia.
2.4.
And so the people that you would mobilize are the same people that you need to run the war economy, right? So there's a shortage of people, men really, given the way, you know, they operate, that creates this tension. And so if you if you do another mobilization, probably there will be another, perhaps temporary, but nonetheless outflow of people to Kazakhstan or wherever, and that'll just exacerbate all those problems. So it's much politically much better to avoid anything like that and do maybe some hidden mobilizations, right? Maybe either through these payments or the prisoners that were sent to the front and all this kind of thing, right? It's just, there are political constraints. You know, we think, yes, Putin is a dictator, he can do whatever he wants, but he's not unconstrained.
Right.
And that's I think part of it.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah. Thank you.
I was wondering.
No. First, please represent yourself. You know, introduce yourself.
I'm Stephen Wheeler.
I don't
With
see what.
Ukraine's Kursk offensive, and Russia seemed to keep its focus in the Donbass and not really like redirecting a sizable portion of its like army back to recapture that. What, if anything, does that tell you about their like state of mind or how they plan to keep on fighting the war?
Yeah, I mean, the Kursk offensive was an interesting gamble in a way by the Ukrainian side, right? And their goals were to do two things, and they achieved one of them. The first goal was to change the narrative, so we can still take territory, right? And they achieved that, at least in the short term. But the second, and arguably the most important, was that to create a dilemma for Russia, which is either we ease pressure in the Donbass by moving forces to defend Kursk, or we lose Russian territory. And the Russian leadership answered this challenge by saying, we don't care about Russian territory. We're going to, we know Ukraine won't, like, they don't want this territory, they don't need this territory. We'll just let them hold it for a while. We'll bomb them. They'll take casualties. It's not. It's a minor political embarrassment which is surprising, right? That's not how we thought it would go. But nonetheless, what's important is to continue progress in the Donbass, because we have the goal of controlling all of Donetsk Oblast by some time, you know, which moves around, but whatever. And so what that suggests to me is that the command went out that the offensive is the top priority, and we'll mop up Kursk later.
But it was quite an embarrassment. It was the first time since the World War II that foreign troops got on the Russian territory.
Yes.
It was quite an embarrassment to Putin. And, you know, according to sources in Moscow, you know, Putin was very he expected his generals to deliver him, the success in Kursk, meaning, kicking out Ukrainian troops as a gift for his yesterday's birthday.
Well,
And they failed to do it.
well, you can't do it if you don't get, you can.
45,000 their troops.
What?
45,000
Yeah,
troops.
well, yeah, but not the, they took some, not the best ones, right? Troops are not all the same, right? If you're using territorial defense, if you're using conscripts, it's not the same thing as battle-hardened, units from the front.
Okay. Next question.
Thank you so much, first of all, for letting us ask questions. My name is Naida Alim, and I'm a student from Kazakhstan. I've heard the term mass mobilization as a prediction, at least for the next 2 or 3 years. And specifically, the thing that's connected to ODKB, or Central Asian Support and Parallel Imports. If there's any projection in terms of your data, Mr. Golts, there will be conscripts that are attracted from Central Asian countries. For example, from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan.
Wait a second.
Speaking about conscripts, it's absolutely clear they cannot use people from foreign countries as conscripts. Only Russian citizens can be drafted. And there is a long story when Russian authorities want to draft person in a moment he receive Russian passport. I mean, immigrants from CIS countries. Another interesting story is recruiting people from CIS countries, and not only from CIS countries, but even from Africa, Asia, anywhere. Where look, Russia is paying good money. $2,000 a month is comparable with salary of American military, and is much higher than salary of many military in European countries. So it's good money, and of course you can theoretically. You can find people, and I suppose people from Kazakhstan and other republics will buy this proposal, will agree to risk their life for money. It's quite possible, but it's not about conscription. It's about volunteer recruiting. And again, it's very interesting question. Does mother country permits this or that citizen to be mercenary or not? For example, Cuba, which that surprised me very strongly. They strongly rejected the idea that their people participate this war in Ukraine, mentioning that Cuban citizens cannot be mercenary. And it depends of position of Kazakh, Tajiks, and other governments also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions?
Just a quick question. I'm David Ehrenthal. I am surprised I haven't heard the word nuclear.
That's the question that I have on
I'm
the
curious as to what that means.
Say the question again?
Why has the topic of nuclear weapons not come up in this conversation?
There will be a special session on that on October 22nd. David Hoffman of the Washington Post is preparing a presentation on that. But I do have this question. And first, of course, it's the question to which extent we can trust Putin to use nuclear weapons, because he's constantly and very successfully, he blackmails West all the time. any minute, Ukrainians say, oh, we would like to shoot, Russian military targets located on the territory of the Russian Federation. Not that I like this, because, obviously I'm a patriot and Russia is my country. However, immediately Putin says this, then, Ukrainians ask for that. Putin responds saying he's going to use the nuclear weapons. And his latest decision was that he can use nuclear weapons regardless of if another country, is going to use nuclear weapons. That any country which has nuclear capabilities, if it stands behind Ukrainians, then he's going to use nuclear weapons. Of course, it's a blackmail, but that's what I'm going to ask you guys.
Okay.
Do you believe that he's capable? Sasha, first, I will ask Dmitry Gorenburg, and then I will get back to you. Okay?
So I think I largely don't believe, right? I think that if we
unlike President Biden.
President Biden is paid to assess risks to the United States, right? And the cost of it's like the cost benefit analysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what he believes. I don't talk to him. But what I see is that every time the West is talking about some new weapon or some new capability that they may give to Ukraine, and the most recent one a couple of weeks ago was right in the middle of the discussion on whether to allow Ukraine to use long-range American missiles against Russian targets within Russia, right? Putin makes some statement or something related. When these capabilities are provided or allowed, there are no statements about that is forgotten. Not forgotten, but that's not when the rhetoric happens. The rhetoric is clearly being modulated to shape the decision making on whether or not to give the weapon. Now, there was an earlier point when the U.S. intelligence community, and I don't know what went into that, but we've heard the reports. There was a moment when they were assessing that there was a 50-50 chance that Russia would use nuclear weapons when the war was going kind of fairly badly in the fall of 2022. And I don't know what where they were getting their intelligence or how they were getting to those numbers. But and you'll notice that most recently, when there was also like in the media right around the time of this discussion with the long-range weapons, there was a publication about the intelligence community, U.S. intelligence community, highlighting that if we do this, there will be escalation from the Russian side. This was interpreted as a nuclear, potential nuclear, but that's not what the intelligence community was saying. They're saying there would be escalation. There are other ways to escalate, right? Including providing weapons to, Houthis in Yemen, or various things that Russia could do to escalate that don't involve nuclear weapons. So I am, and we've had this conversation, and Putin wants to live, right? It's clear that like he got from the news today, he made sure to get COVID tests from Donald Trump in 2020. Using nuclear weapons reduces his or increases his risk of not living. Let's put it that way.
Right. Alexander.
Okay, I agree to.
First, wait. Yes. Sasha, wait. Before you answer this question, I will ask you the affiliated one. Tell me, to the best of your knowledge, what is the procedure in starting the nuclear war? that existed in Russia. So Putin is a commander-in-chief, and he can give this order. So what is the procedure? There are, as far as I understand, 5 people are involved. He cannot do it himself, right? He can press the...
Okay, of course not. He have so-called...
Tell me about the procedure. Tell me about the procedure.
Okay, he has so-called new... I don't know how many people participate, but he has his so-called nuclear briefcase. So what he have to do is to push the button in order to inform all others that president, commander-in-chief made his decision. After this, this order is doubled by defense minister and chief of general staff. Then command goes to 3 branches of nuclear forces, such as strategic rocket forces, Navy component, and aviation component. So the same time, there is so-called dead hand. There is a special place somewhere in Ural Mountains, which is ready to start nuclear war autonomously in case some signal will be stopped will be not goes from Kremlin. And your next guest wrote a book on this issue. So I think
5 people between Putin's decision and starting a nuclear weapon, at least 5 people, and all those 5 people should agree that their lives and their wealth and well-being of their families should go into the nuclear waste. Do we really believe it's going to happen in the
Yevgenia, again, it's not question for me, I think. I'm not psychologist.
I understand.
It all depends, again, these people gave oath to motherland and Mr. Putin, and they, for all years of their service in nuclear forces, they were trained to make such kind of decision.
We know that the nuclear...
I will not exclude, sorry, I will not exclude they can do it automatically, because they are trained to do this automatically.
Who, Minister of Defense? Chief of Staff? Are you kidding me?
No. These people will translate
It's one of the...
At the end of the day, it will be majors and colonels who will push red button in the command center of strategic nuclear forces.
Okay, so
can I add one thing?
Yes, please, of course.
Because the one thing that flashed that report that we just published on debates in Russian nuclear community.
CNA, you mean?
Yeah, CNA. Yeah. Moscow doesn't believe in tears is the title, but the thing is that one of the, and this discussion was started by Sergei Karaganov,
who is of course nobody drunks. I should stop here. And we always know whenever he starts talking about use of nuclear weapons, it means that he was drunk for the last 10 days. Okay, go ahead.
Possibly.
Okay, nevertheless, Zhenya, his drunk speeches turned into Putin's words about changing military doctrine. A year ago, Putin, Karaganov insisted on changing nuclear doctrine, and now they pretend to change nuclear doctrine. So maybe we'll speak about Putin was drunk or what?
But I think the point is that this is actually, these speeches are important. And Medvedev tweeting, maybe also drunk, I don't know, is important. Because what it does is that, and every time, they go on some TV show, Solovyov or whatever, and talk about nuclear weapons and how it's part of our, great powerness or whatever it is. It means that the population that's watching this or listening to this becomes a little bit more acclimated to the possibility, right? So that major that Sasha was talking about is that much more likely to have in his head that this is okay. So I think I don't know if it's the intended goal of those discussions, but I think it is part of the result. And also, there's a great book that was published maybe 6 years ago now by Dima Adamski, who was a great specialist in Israel, called Russian Nuclear Orthodoxy. And it's about the connection between the Russian Orthodox Church and the military, and particularly the nuclear part of the military. And again, if you're blessing missiles, and the priests, priests are still trusted more than others, right? Again, it gives this imprimatur, this legitimacy to the potential nuclear use, and that's dangerous.
Dmitry, I have hard time believing, I interviewed Karaganov 5 times, and when I turned the mic off, he always said, "No, Zhenya, you understand. I have to make my living." So obviously, I believe that the scenario was as following: that Karaganov was summoned up to the presidential administration and was told, stop talking about that. And he's the kind of a guy, and we know that, he has a couple of apartments in European Union, and he's the kind of a guy which, always ready to do what people in power tell him. He doesn't have options to go outside and etc. So with Putin, remember at the Valdai Club, when Karaganov was once again talking about the use of nuclear weapons, Putin said, he pretended as if, he's the only European in Russia, as they used to call him. So it is bluff. I cannot believe that these people who were busy stealing everything in the country and making this immense wealth, look, at the Putin's palace, his residence, his Valdai residence, his Sochi residence, this and that. The guy who is afraid to use planes, the guy who is they made the special armed train for him to go from Moscow to Valdai, it's just, 2 hours by car. So I have a hard time that it's not just about Putin. We do understand that there is, people around him who are worth, several $1 billion. Yuri Kovalchuk, his closest guy, 2.5 to
we all agree.
and etc. So no, I'm afraid that you guys here in the West, you tend to scare yourself. That's how, that's also, helps to explain why Ukrainians haven't received, the kind of missiles that they needed, the kind of F-16s that they needed, and etc. Anyway, I don't want, yes, let's go back to the audience. And once again, on October the 22nd, David Hoffman, who wrote that, he is going to come here in person, and he's going to speak precisely about the use of the possibilities of the new nuclear war, not just Russia, but also China, but predominantly Russia. And I'm going to ask him, what are Americans' abilities to control all this movement of nuclear heads in Russia and in China? Go ahead, please.
American.
No, I cannot hear you. And first, I want to know, who are you?
My name is Eric.
What's your name?
Eric.
And what's your last name? Eric, are you, you prefer to be anonymous? Okay, are you going to introduce yourself?
Yeah,
Please do.
my name is Eric Tugel,
Okay.
and my question for the panelists is,
I cannot hear you. Can you speak up, please?
yeah, my question for the panelists is, in the course of your research, did you find anything that indicated maybe a different perspective on the southern occupied provinces versus the Donbass that's getting a lot of attention?
Perspective, you mean in Russia or
From the Russian perspective.
oh, like what the Russian government or military thinks about the two.
Like Kherson province.
Yeah, I
liberation
understand.
versus it now.
Sasha, do you want to start this one, or do you want me to?
Sorry, I don't understand what Russian military thinks
I'll
of.
relate, because it's so the question is, are the Russian leadership or military treating Donbass provinces, Luhansk, Donetsk, differently, or thinking about them differently from Kherson and Zaporizhzhia? So east versus south.
I think from military point of view, it's more or less clear that Lugansk and Donbass are the first targets of Russian invasion because they had base for advance from these regions. And of course, it's a huge shame for Mr. Putin that he failed to take over Donbass for these 2.5 years. So I can imagine how frustrated he is speaking with his generals, and that's why they are conducting this advance in Donetsk, because Donetsk is a primary target. Zaporizhzhia and his Kherson is a little bit another question, because partly they are under Ukrainian control, and in my mind, they look a little bit secondary from military point of view as a secondary targets of Russian advance.
I'll just add one. I agree. The only thing I would add is that I think the primary purpose of the southern regions, or the parts of them that Russia controls, is to ensure land access to Crimea.
Mhm.
And so that means that there's not a particular need to go farther, especially across the river, back, that part of Kherson that they gave up. But it is important to protect what they have occupied already, because otherwise that land bridge would be in danger.
But there are reports that Russians are building a railroad.
Mm-hmm.
So even if Ukrainians manage to destroy the Kerchensky Bridge,
Mm-hmm.
they're building this railroad that will allow will go
Mm-hmm.
through Mariupol,
Mm-hmm.
or that will allow to supply stuff to Crimea by land.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay, so you don't think that Russians will occupy Kharkiv region?
Oh, well, I was talking about the south versus Donetsk.
Okay.
Kharkiv region, I mean, Kharkiv itself is a huge city that is, the problem for Kharkiv is that if they occupy a little bit of the region, then if Kharkiv is within artillery range, again, as it was earlier.
Just 45 kilometers from the Russian border.
Yeah, but that's not quite, if it's closer, then this was the danger of the offensive, the short offensive that they had in Kharkiv a few months ago, that if Kharkiv is an artillery range, they don't need to, they can destroy, they can make it unlivable, So that's the danger for Kharkiv.
And that's exactly what Putin is doing. We have to run up this very interesting conversation, but there is one question that I cannot help but ask you. Some analysts say that the West failed in the face of Russian aggression, as it failed to provide Ukraine with the necessary ammunition, and the ammunition that it needed regarding the volume of supplies, duration, and the quality of those supplies. As a result, post-communist countries that had been oriented towards the European Union, such as, for instance, Georgia in the Caucasus, began to turn toward Putin's Russia. And it's pretty rational. They see that the West is not in a rush to support Ukraine. That's why, and they see Russians, who threaten them with another invasion, or alternatively, Putin will support Georgia with money and with all kinds of stuff. Why did West turn out to be so weak? Or is it not about the West's weakness, but a calculated decision to bleed Russian defense industry as much as possible at the expense, unfortunately, of the lives of the Ukrainians?
So, it's kind of a loaded question, of course.
Sorry.
But, and I think it's more complicated than that, right? The West, it's been, what, 2.5 years?
Yes.
At various points, the West, you could say the West was stronger than expected. At other points, you could say it was weaker than expected over the 2.5 years, right? Initially, I think the West was stronger than most people expected.
Really?
Yeah. Because I think stronger than Putin expected. The European unanimity and the strength of support for Ukraine, he didn't expect Germany to provide any equipment. Now, it took Germany some weeks or months to change its whole military and foreign policy, essentially, right, on weapons, but it did. And not with Merkel, but with Scholz, who was from SPD, who is supposedly more pro-Russian, right? So this is, I don't think this was I think one of the reasons why the invasion happened, just one small one, was that Merkel's departure made Putin think, the strong German leader is gone. Now it's opportunity. I mean, there are many other reasons, but that was one factor.
Okay.
So I think, and the fact that the West provided the weapons that it did as quickly as it did, I think was also surprising. Now, the question you're asking is, why didn't they just do everything all at once, right? That's what you're actually asking. Why didn't they give, F-16s and long-range missiles in the spring of 2022? Well, the U.S. government's, or Biden's, let's say, calculation, and also, I shouldn't say Biden's the combination of Biden and Scholz and all the leaders, right, because they had to work together, had to, there was the question of what was politically acceptable. And there was a fear, we can say it was, they were outbluffed by Putin, sure, but there was a fear that if Ukraine won too fast, then Russia would use those nuclear weapons, right? Whether that's a legitimate fear or not, given the time, you can discuss that in 2 weeks. Right. But it was there. And so there was a decision, and we can already discuss whether it was correct or incorrect, to gradually, ramp up assistance. And there was a time when they thought that was good enough. It turned out to be wrong. But, if we have to put our minds back to the counteroffensive, the preparation for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, right? So if we go back to the spring of 2023, everyone was waiting to see just how successful Ukraine was going to be, right? How quickly could they get to the Azov Sea? Turned out to not be the case. Russia had gotten enough time to prepare and had what I talked about at the beginning 2 hours ago. But you have to think about the mentality at any given time. So I don't think I think it's not. I think it's just incorrect to say that they're using Ukraine to bleed Russia. They would. I think if anything, Western capitals would like the war to be over, and if Ukraine also won, that would be great, right? So I think that's the primary objective, but they have other objectives, right? They have the desire to not start a big war with Russia. They have a desire for Russia not to escalate, right? So these things, we're here as analysts. We don't have to think those thoughts. We can focus on what we care about. But
Okay.
I don't know, Sasha.
Sasha, would you like to add?
Okay, look, I prefer to look at this problem from another angle. The problem is a psychological problem that Russia thinks that it is in war against the West, but West doesn't think that it is in Cold War with Russia. These 30 years of peace after collapse of Soviet Union played its role. And now we need, I think people in the West need time to understand the situation. Also, look, it cannot be happen at once. Americans, the production of military equipment is a long process. I'll give you only one example. To receive powder for shells, Europeans have to buy it in Bosnia or in Albania. There are no plants that are producing powder in EU countries, for example. So you need to restart to build these long production lines. It will not happen at once. And of course, until now, here in the West, nevertheless, European countries or United States, we still have a peace mentality, where people still want to pacify Mr. Putin somehow, and it's a real problem.
Okay. Thank you very much, Aleksandr Golts. Thank you very much, Dmitry Gorenburg. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. So we're going to discuss in depth the possibility of the nuclear disaster, on October 22nd in 2 weeks. So thank you so much. Please be ready. Please come in 2 weeks, and we will continue.